Every World Cup qualification has its stories, and so far we've heard amazing tales from Iceland, the smallest nation to ever make it, Panama, who overcame the murder of one of their players to also make their debut, and Egypt, a team that has been on a 20-year journey that has seen revolution and counter-revolution play its role. But for arguably Asia's best team, World Cup qualification was something of a breeze. Iran were the third team to qualify for Russia 2018 after the hosts and Brazil. Team Melli waltzed through their opening group, going unbeaten. The final group stage was slightly trickier, but they again breezed through unbeaten against South Korea, China and memorably Syria. A 2-2 draw in Tehran had seen the war-torn country qualify for an ultimately unsuccessful playoff against Australia, but I digress. Iran had played 18 games, scored 36 goals, conceded just 5 and had gone the entire qualification campaign unbeaten. For Iran's longtime manager, the former Manchester United assistant and Real Madrid and Portugal national team coach, Carlos Queiroz, it was his second World Cup with Iran. But as ever, when it comes to Iranian football, what was happening under the surface was often more revealing than what was happening on the pitch. Iran's first World Cup came in 1978, when the team famously played a Scotland team that had declared they would almost certainly be winning it. A 3-1 defeat to Peru soon ended that notion, but it was the second game that was perhaps the first glimpse many had of Iranian football. Iran held Scotland to a 1-1 draw. But soon Iranian football would effectively stop thanks to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The deeply unpopular Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was removed from power after an uprising. A popular Shia cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini, returned to take power. The Shah was a US and Western ally, which led to a deterioration of relations and eventually Iran's international isolation. Iran was transformed from one of the most liberal countries in the region to an effective theocracy, and football ground to a halt. The Iran-Iraq War had begun, with Iraq's Saddam Hussein backed by the US and its allies, and all able-bodied men were needed on the front line. Nearly 1 million people died in a vicious conflict that saw missiles fall on both capitals, the use of chemical weapons and trench warfare reminiscent of World War I. When it ended, the league restarted, but it wasn't until France '98 that Team Melli would return to a World Cup finals. Ayatollah Khomeini had died. Meanwhile, a reformist cleric, Mohammad Khatami, had been elected president, promising to steer reforms and give greater freedoms. Famously, Iran was drawn in the same group as the great Shaitan itself, Team USA. What happened next is perhaps one of the most memorable single moments in World Cup history. Iran beat the US 2-1. 1 million people celebrated on the streets of Tehran. In the end, Iran missed out on the knockout stage, but when they returned in 2006, things were very different. The hardline populist former mayor of Tehran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, had been elected president. He was a huge football fan and would turn up for training to see arguably Iran's greatest ever generation of players, which included a now veteran Ali Daei, who had enjoyed a long career in the Bundesliga and still holds the world record for international goals scored. The team also contained Mehdi Makhdavikia, who spent 12 years in Germany, a young midfielder by the name of Masoud Shojaei, more on him later, and the mercurial Ali Karimi, who'd been signed by Bayern Munich as Michael Ballack's replacement. Ahmadinejad's election and an increasingly bellicose Republican administration in the US headed by George W. Bush, who had famously included Iran in his Axis of Evil speech, meant that Iran had again become a pariah state. Several politicians from around the world called for Iran to be thrown out of the World Cup after Ahmadinejad had made several comments that diminished the suffering of Jews during the Holocaust. Holocaust denial is a crime in Germany. Others wanted Ahmadinejad arrested on arrival if he came to watch Team Melli play. Anti-Iranian protests followed the team at Germany 2006, and Daei was at the end of his career and Karimi struggling with an injury. Iran limped out after gaining just a single point against Angola. Qualification for 2010 was even more fraught. Amir Galanoy was hired and then fired before the legendary Ali Daei was drafted in. He too was sacked after losing to bitter rivals Saudi Arabia. So, the Iranian Football Federation turned to one place that no one thought they would: America. Well, kind of. Afshin Ghotbi had left for the US after the 1979 revolution, settled in California and became a soccer coach. He was even in the backroom staff for Team USA during that famous match at France '98. After a stint as assistant coach at LA Galaxy, he was hired in 2017 as coach of Tehran Giants Persepolis. When he arrived in Iran, The first time he'd been back since leaving, he was greeted by his mother and tens of thousands of adoring fans. He brought Persepolis the title that season in dramatic fashion and was then hired for Team Melli, although some radical voices were deeply sceptical about his appointment. Still, Gottby almost salvaged qualification. It came down to the final match against South Korea in Seoul. Back in Iran, a huge protest movement, the Green Movement, had risen up to challenge the 2009 election results, which protesters believed had been stolen by Ahmadinejad. At the game in Seoul, Masoud Shojoy had given Iran an early lead, but several of the players had worn green wristbands at the start of the game, allegedly in sympathy with the protesters. Park Ji-sung scored a late equaliser and Iran were eliminated. The players went home to face the music. The Green Movement was crushed and the players were in the firing line. It was reported that the government banned the players who wore the wristbands from playing for the national team, but after FIFA investigated, the Iran Federation said that wasn't the case. Several players have since played again for Iran. Gottby limped on to the Asian Cup a few months later, but was sacked after a quarter-final exit. So, next came Carlos Queiroz, a rumbustious, straight-talking character who had just come out of a bruising relationship with the Portuguese national team. Since 2011, he has navigated the choppy waters of Iranian football, politics and society with aplomb, occasionally falling out with the powers that be, but always backing his players. He took Iran back to the World Cup finals in Brazil 2014, but they'd been drawn in a tough group with Nigeria, Argentina and Bosnia, and only managed 1 goal and 1 point. Still, Team Melli roared back with an unbeaten qualification for Russia 2018 that still had its controversies, most notably with Masoud Shojoy, who was playing for Panionios in the Greek league. Panionios had qualified for the Europa League and were drawn against Maccabi Tel Aviv. Since 1979, Iran has had an unofficial policy of refusing to compete against Israeli sportsmen and women, but Shojoy and Ihsan Hajsafi played against Maccabi, which led to a furious reaction by some radical factions back home. Several politicians and newspapers demanded they be banned from the national team. Shojoy especially had already incurred their wrath, having worn a green wristband allegedly supporting pro-democracy protesters in 2009, and for bringing up the issue of women being banned from Iranian football stadiums with the current president Hassan Rouhani. For 6 months, Shojoy wasn't in any of Iran's squads, but Queiroz brought him back in March this year despite the pressure from some quarters. He played in friendlies against Algeria and Tunisia and made it to the provisional 2018 World Cup squad. For Russia 2018, Iran has again been handed a tough group with Morocco, Spain and Portugal. But Iran arguably has its best team ever, with players going into the finals in top form and playing as a more cohesive whole, something that bedeviled the great generation of Karimi and Dai. Up front, there is Sardar Azmoun, an outrageously talented centre-forward. He currently plays for Rubin Kazan in Russia and, after a lean spell, has returned to both scoring and creating goals. But the form player is Ali Reza Jahanbakhsh, top scorer in the Dutch Eredivisie this season, the first Asian player to achieve such a feat in a top European league. He finished with 21 goals and made 12 assists for AZ Alkmaar. For all his troubles, Masoud Shojoy won the Greek title with AEK Athens. Saman Ghoddos had an exceptional season with Swedish team Östersund, who famously went deep into this year's Europa League. Former Fulham midfielder Ashkan Dejaga is in the provisional squad but is still recovering from injury. If Team Melli can overcome the usual encroachment of politics and influence that seems to bedevil their World Cup appearances, Iran could well be the dark horse in Russia this summer.